He remembers the loss as if it were his own, even though he never met her. Not the details, those are blurred, softened by time and by the way people edit themselves when they speak of the past. But the feeling that something gentle had been interrupted too abruptly. The first image in his mind is not of a room or a fall or a report. It's of a face in a photograph, eyes caught between laughter and worry, as if she had just heard a secret she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Her name was Elena Maris Kline, 26 years old. A part-time librarian at the community college in a small Colorado town, and a photographer who took portraits of trees as if they had personal histories. She had come to Linden Creek from Denver 2 years before her death, looking, according to her sister, for something quieter than her own thoughts. On the night she disappeared from herself, the records say the wind was high and dry over the foothills. A neighbor heard music through the thin apartment wall, an old song looping, restarting when the cassette reached its end. Someone else saw her balcony light flicker. Someone thought they heard raised voices on the phone. No one is sure anymore whether they truly remember these things or if they were gathered later, borrowed from each other's versions. The file calls it an ambiguous fall. That was the phrase that first caught the investigator's attention all those years ago, when he was still new and believed that names in folders were waiting to be rescued. An ambiguous fall from the third-floor balcony down onto the patch of lawn edged by snow. No sign of a struggle, they said. No clear farewell either. She left a cup of tea half-finished on her table, steam still rising when they found her. The front door was locked from the inside. The balcony door was slightly open, curtain pulled across as if trying to protect the room from the cold. He has read these sentences so often that they feel like lines from a story he was told as a child. Something recited more for moral weight than precision. Yet each time he imagines it, the scene shifts. The angle of her body, the tilt of her head, the exact position of her hands. In one version, her fingers are curled as if holding onto something that isn't there. In another, they are open and strangely relaxed, as if letting go came easily. The first officer at the scene wrote, "Expression peaceful." The paramedic noted, "Jaw slightly tense." A later consultant added a comment in the margin, "Hard to tell. Faces lie." That last line stayed with him. Faces lie. Or perhaps they carry too much truth all at once, and no one knows how to read it. What unsettles him, sitting at his desk decades later, is not the photograph of Elena's stillness, but the earlier ones. The black and white self-portrait she took pressed up against a window, her reflection layered with falling snow. The candid snapshot at a faculty picnic where she looks away from the camera towards someone outside the frame, half smiling, half unsure. The library ID where she looks directly ahead, as if trying to meet the future halfway. In none of them does she look like someone who is about to step over the edge of anything. But people say that all the time, as if there were a set expression for crossing thresholds. The official conclusion was left open, like a door not fully closed. No clear note, no confession, no sign of another presence that night. No fingerprints on the balcony rail that did not belong to her. Her family refused to accept that she had chosen such an exit. The town disliked thinking that anyone among them might have pushed her. So they settled into a quiet stalemate with the unknown, the way a community sometimes does, everyone agreeing not to look too closely, for fear of what the closer look might demand. For years, her name rested in a cardboard box with others like it, dates fading on the tab. He told himself he remembered her case because of its peculiar stillness, because there was something unnervingly gentle about the way it resisted resolution. But if he is honest with himself, and he tries to be, more now than before, he knows there was something else. The way her sister spoke at the first interview. The way her voice shook, not when describing the night, but when describing Elena's laughter. She always made it sound like she didn't believe she deserved to be as glad as she was. The sister had said, looking down at her hands, even when things were going well, like she was waiting for someone to tap her on the shoulder and say, "Sorry, there's been a mistake." He had underlined that sentence in his notes, not because it was evidence, but because it felt like a key to a locked inner room that no one had ever opened. Now, many years later, a headline appears in a local paper's digital archive, Colorado, 1991, cold case solved, arrests, shocks community. The words are firm, decisive, full of certainty. The article insists that answers have finally been found, that what was once indistinct has now been painted in clean lines. But as he reads, something inside him resists. The story of Elena's passing has never felt simple. If there is now an official solution, he wonders whose comfort it serves. He closes his eyes and tries to recall the first time he saw her file, the way his younger self had felt standing at the threshold of her story. He cannot remember the exact moment, only the echo of a question that has never truly left him. When someone falls, where does the choice end and the world begin? The memory of that question feels more intimate than many of his own personal recollections. It is as if her uncertainty has been living inside him all this time. A quiet room he visits without turning on the light. He opens the file again. The pages smell faintly of dust and toner and something else, the lingering trace of decisions made and unmade. Somewhere between the lines, he senses a grief that never found a shape, only a series of partial sentences. Her death sits before him like a photograph that refuses to come into focus. He knows what the reports say, what the new article insists, what the town has chosen to believe at various times. But behind all of this, he feels the weight of something unfinished, something that cannot be captured by timelines or diagrams. What unsettles him most is not the absence of answers, but the possibility that the answers themselves might be a kind of disguise. He closes the folder gently, as if not to disturb her, and understands that whatever has been solved out there, the real question, the intimate, unclear one, is still waiting for him. Unchanged since 1991.2, a forgotten witness or document reopens the cold investigation. The document surfaces by accident, in the way important things sometimes do, slipping out from where they were quietly resting, as if tired of being overlooked. It appears in a box labeled MISC 1990s, a cardboard container sagging at the sides, on a high shelf in the records room. He is not looking for it. He has come down there on a different errand, chasing a separate memory that refuses to match its own paperwork. The fluorescent lights hum softly. The air carries the faint scent of old paper and metal cabinets. A strange comfort. A stack of cassette tapes has toppled inside the box, their labels worn pale. When he adjusts them, something thin and folded slides out from between two plastic cases and lands at his feet. A letter, yellowed at the edges, folded into thirds. He almost puts it back, because there is always more paper than time, and because he has learned that not every rediscovered scrap deserves to be read. But his eyes catch the name in the top right corner, written in a careful, slanting hand, Elena M. Kline, dated March 3rd, 1991. 2 weeks before the night she fell. The letter was never mailed. The stamp outline on the envelope is empty. In the corner, a simple notation in ballpoint pen, found in apartment desk drawer. No initials, no follow-up. He feels a faint, familiar tightening in his chest. The feeling of approaching someone else's private threshold. He unfolds the page, slowly. The letter is addressed to someone named Nora, Elena's older sister, he realizes, though he does not recall this particular mention in any earlier summary. Perhaps it was overlooked. Perhaps someone hesitated and then simply moved on. Dear Nora, it begins. You always said I should write things down instead of pretending they're not there. He reads each line as if listening rather than looking. The sentences do not describe dates or threats or clear plans. They curve inwards, circling feelings without naming them outright. Elena writes of the town's silence, of the way people greet each other kindly while keeping their distance. She writes about the library's late evenings, how she has grown fond of watching the same students wander the stacks, searching for something they cannot quite define. She writes of a person without giving a full name, just an initial, J. J says, I think too much about how things might end and not enough about how they are, she confides. But sometimes I feel like we are all standing on invisible edges and pretending we are on solid ground. She mentions a night on the balcony, the wind lifting the curtains, the lights of the houses below blinking like patient eyes. It feels like I'm being watched, but not in a cruel way, she adds. More like the mountains keep track of who we are, even when we wish they wouldn't. The letter grows more hesitant near the end, words crowded together, some scratched out. She hints at an unnamed pressure, at something she has promised to keep quiet about. I agreed, even though it made my chest feel tight, she writes. Maybe I'm making too much of it. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe I'm just tired. There is one final sentence, underlined. If anything ever happens and it looks like I chose it, please remember that wanting to stay and not knowing how to are not the same thing. He reads that line 3 times, each time feeling it alter the shape of the past, not by clarifying it, but by deepening the shadows. This letter should have changed everything. It should have been read, considered, woven into the official narrative. Instead, it slipped into a box and went to sleep for decades. Like a voice clearing its throat in an empty hall, he imagines the original investigator, overwhelmed by casaloads, skimming pages late at night under heavy eyelids. Perhaps they meant to return to it and never did. Perhaps they folded it carefully, intending to speak with the sister, then got called to another scene and never found their way back. Forgetfulness, he has learned, is not always careless. Sometimes it is a quiet defense against what the heart knows it cannot bear to contemplate. Still, the letter is here now, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. He signs it into evidence again, a formality that feels almost ceremonial, as if he is returning her voice to the official record. The clerk glances at the date and raises an eyebrow. From that case, she asks softly. He nods. I thought they said it was all settled, she continues, then hesitates. With the new arrests and everything, he notices the way she says they, as if the conclusion belongs to someone else. Maybe it is, he answers. Maybe it isn't. He pauses, choosing his words with care. Sometimes, when something is declared settled, all that really means is that people need it to be. She looks at the letter, then at him. Her gaze lingers, as if she wants to ask more, but chooses not to. There is a brief silence that feels almost like respect for Elena, for time, for the limits of what anyone can truly know. Later that evening, alone in his office, he pulls out the old interview transcripts. The pages crackle faintly. He revisits the statements from neighbors, colleagues, the sister, the few close acquaintances listed at the time. He finds mention of Jay in only one place, a line in a friend's statement. She spent a lot of time with Jay the last few months. The friend had said, they were close, I think. Then she didn't really like to talk about it. No one asked who Jay was, or if they did, it never made it into the file. His pen hovers over the margin before he writes, slowly, "Who is Jay?" The question feels both very late and somehow new. The next day, he requests access to archived phone logs, library schedules, faculty rosters from that year. Most people would frame this as a new push for evidence, a renewed effort to solve what has already been declared solved. But that is not how he feels it. For him, reopening the case is not about proving someone right or wrong. It is about something more fragile. The sense that Elena's story has been flattened into a single line when, in truth, it was made of many overlapping ones. In the years since 1991, he has seen how a community can gradually rearrange a loss until it fits neatly into shared comfort. The headline about the case being solved gave people a way to close their eyes gently and say, finally, that the past had been put in order. This letter refuses that order. It suggests a life lived in subtle tension, in unspoken negotiations and quiet compromises. It hints that the night on the balcony was not a simple choice nor a fully external act, but something more complex, where inner storms and outer pressures met at a fragile edge. He leans back in his chair and stares at the ceiling for a long moment. The investigation is officially reopened now. The paperwork will say it was because of newly discovered documentary evidence. But in his heart, he knows it began the moment he unfolded that page and heard Elena speak again. From a distance that felt alarmingly close, he thinks of Nora, who was told, years later, that there had been no sign of any message left behind. He wonders whether hearing this letter now will comfort her or burden her, or both at once. He senses that whatever he discovers from this point forward will not simplify the past. It will make it more honest, perhaps, but also more difficult to hold. Truth, he has learned, rarely behaves like closure. It behaves more like an echo, arriving late, out of sync, carrying both relief and unease. 3. Investigator. Focuses on human psychology more than physical clues. He does not start with photographs or diagrams this time. He starts with people, not their statements, but their silences. The first person he visits is Nora, Elena's sister, now in her 50s. She lives in a quiet Denver neighborhood, in a narrow house filled with plants that seem to be always reaching toward the same window. She opens the door before he knocks, as if she's been expecting this moment for years. "You found something," she says, not as a question. He nods and holds up a copy of the letter, carefully folded. "We came across this in an old box," he explains. It was written 2 weeks before. He stops himself there, feeling how the word that wants to come next would land between them. Before that night, Nora's eyes move to the paper, then away. "Of course, she wrote something," she murmurs, almost to herself. She always did. That's how she tried to keep from overflowing. He sets the letter on the kitchen table between them. She does not reach for it. Instead, she looks past it, at a point on the wall just above his shoulder. "Do you want me to read it aloud?" he asks gently, "or would you prefer to read it on your own later?" She hesitates, fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "You read it," she says finally, "so I can listen without trying to control what I remember." As he reads, he watches her more than the words. At some sentences, her hands tighten. At others, her shoulders relax, as if hearing Elena's phrasing again brings a strange relief. When he reaches the underlined line about appearances and choices, Nora closes her eyes. "That sounds like her," she whispers. She was always trying to explain feelings that didn't fit into simple boxes. He waits. This is the part of the conversation that does not appear in official transcripts. The long pause where people decide what part of themselves to reveal. "I never believed she wanted to go," Nora says eventually. "But I also knew she carried a heaviness she never quite understood. When they told me there was no sign of any message, I thought maybe she had given up on explaining herself. That hurt more than anything." Her gaze finally drops to the paper, and she pulls it closer, unfolding it completely. Knowing she tried, even if no one read it. She trails off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "What did you think of the conclusion back then?" he asks quietly. "About what happened?" Another pause. This one stretches longer, full of careful sorting. "I told everyone I was sure," she replies. "I picked a version of events and held on to it because that's what people needed me to do. They needed me to point outward, not inward." She offers a faint, almost apologetic smile. It's easier to comfort someone who is angry than someone who is lost. He recognizes the truth in that, from both sides of the table. Did she ever mention someone with the initial J? He asks. Nora's expression changes, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle tightening around her mouth. The way her eyes drift toward the doorway as if checking who might overhear. She called him Jonah, she says finally, though sometimes, when she was tired, she said just J. Her fingers tapped lightly on the table. She said he understood how it felt to be the quiet one in a loud room. Do you know his last name? She nods slowly and tells him, but he barely writes it down. What interests him is not the identity itself, but the way she speaks it gently, almost protectively. Did you like him for her? He asks. Nora's lips part, then close again. I liked parts of her with him, she answers. She sounded more hopeful at first, then more cautious. By the end she sounded divided. She looks at him intently. Is that useful to you? Very, he says. More than dates and times, sometimes. He leaves with the name, yes, but also with something more important. A sense of the emotional landscape surrounding Elena in those last months. The way affection and uncertainty tangled together. The way loyalty can make someone hide their doubts, even from themselves. The next person he visits is a former colleague from the library, Marianne, now retired. She lives near Linden Creek, in a small house with a view of the same mountains that once watched Elena's balcony. Marianne greets him politely, wary but open. When he mentions Elena, her eyes soften in a way that suggests unfinished conversations. She was the kind of person you instinctively wanted to protect. Marianne says, pouring tea. Not because she was fragile, exactly, but because she seemed perpetually surprised that the world could be kind to her. He asks about Jay, about the last week's. Marianne answers, but he pays as much attention to the moments when she hesitates as to the words themselves. He came by the library often, she says. They spoke at the end of the stacks. Not in a secretive way, just a little apart. She pauses, stirring her tea, though it no longer needs stirring. I remember thinking that she seemed both brighter and more restless when he was around. Did you ever hear them argue? He asks. Not loudly, she replies. But once I passed by and she had that look she got when she was trying very hard to stay calm. She smiled at me, but her hand shook when she put a book back on the shelf. Another small silence. He was talking about plans. That's all I caught. Plans and promises. Sometimes those can be more frightening than threats. He notes that line, not only on his pad, but in his mind. Plans and promises. Edges can be made of those two as the days pass. He speaks with more people. A neighbor, a former student, a barista who remembers Elena sitting in the same corner of a cafe, sketching in a small notebook. Each conversation adds not clarity, but texture. Contradictions emerge, not in the facts, but in the feelings. She was getting better, one person insists. She was laughing more. She seemed tired, another says, like someone listening for a sound only she could hear. She told me she finally felt understood. She told me she wasn't sure who she was when she was with him. He learns as much from the ways people protect themselves, how they smooth over certain memories or rush past them, how they use phrases like "I don't remember" when what they may mean is "I'm not ready to revisit that part." In his younger years, he might have pressed harder for specifics. Now he listens for the undercurrent instead. The physical evidence, the balcony measurements, the autopsy photographs, the official timings remains unchanged. But around it, a more intricate picture is forming. A young woman navigating affection, obligation, and an undefined pressure. A circle of people who saw glimpses of her inner weather, but never the full storm. When he finally arranges to meet, Jay, now older, settled, carrying his own history, he prepares not a list of accusations, but a set of questions about feelings. They meet in a small cafe halfway between towns. Jay arrives early, sitting with his hands folded, gaze fixed on the table. When he looks up, there is a flash of recognition in his eyes at the mention of the case, as if he has been quietly preparing for this moment his entire adult life. I heard they say it's solved now, Jay says, voice low. That must make your work easier. Sometimes a label like that makes the work harder, the investigator replies, because people start to believe the story is over when it isn't. Jay looks out the window. His jaw moves slightly, as if he is chewing on a thought. Did you care for her? The investigator asks, bypassing the safer questions. DJ's answer is quiet. Yes, he says. Then, after a long pause, but I also cared for how she made me feel. Those aren't always the same thing. It is in confessions like that, small, unspectacular, unfit for headlines, that the investigator finds the deepest currents of truth. I want to understand what it was like between you, he says. Not just what happened that night, but how you both lived in the days leading up to it. Jay exhales slowly. We planned things, he says. Lives we weren't sure we could carry. I asked more of her than I admitted. She held more inside than she showed. He studies his hands. I told myself she was stronger than she thought. Maybe I needed her to be. The investigator says nothing for a while. The silence thickens, not hostile, but charged. What I'm trying to discover, he finally says, is not who is at fault in a simple way. I'm trying to see whether the way we've told her story respects how complicated she was. Jay's eyes flicker with something like gratitude and fear intertwined. Complicated, he repeats softly. Yes, she was that. And I was not ready for it. As he leaves the cafe, the investigator knows he has gathered no clear proof, no dramatic new revelation. What he has collected instead is a mosaic of human contradictions, love mixed with loyalty tangled with silence, concern shaped by convenience. The physical clues remain what they have always been, ambiguous. The real movement is happening elsewhere, in the shifting understanding of those who remain. He senses that the closer he gets to the emotional core of the case, the less suitable it will be for neat conclusions. Each new insight seems to widen, not narrow, the circle of responsibility. Yet he continues, because this, he believes, is the only kind of justice still possible, not the tidy assignment of blame, but the honest acknowledgement of how deeply we affect one another, often without intending to. And somewhere in that careful, uncomfortable honesty, Elena's presence feels less like a file in a drawer and more like a person again, one whose story cannot be resolved, only held with greater tenderness and unease. He begins to sense, as he moves deeper into the past, that Elena's life was made not of a single defining bond, but of several smaller, fragile constellations, connections that drifted toward and away from her with quiet gravity. Each person he speaks with offers a version of her that feels sincere and yet incomplete, as if they are all describing reflections of a face they never saw straight on. It starts with a name that appears, unexpectedly, Lena Porter, a neighbor whose door faced Elena's across a narrow hallway. The original file mentions her only once, in a brief line about hearing footsteps at irregular hours. But when he finds her decades later, living in a townhouse outside Fort Collins, she remembers more than she ever said. I didn't want to complicate things back then, she admits, eyes lowered to the rim of her cup. People kept saying she was gentle. I didn't want my memories to feel like accusations. He encourages her gently, allowing space for silences to sit between them. She came to my door twice, Lena continues. Once to borrow sugar, the other time just because she looked unsure where else to go. Lena's fingers trace small circles on the wooden table. She seemed torn between wanting to be seen and fearing what would happen if someone looked too closely. He listens as Lena unfolds memories that sound like quiet alarms no one responded to, sudden drops in mood, startled glances toward the stairwell, long pauses before answering innocuous questions, and then Lena hesitates painfully before adding, there was someone else she talked about. Not Jay, someone from before. A long pause. She said she owed him a truth she wasn't ready to tell. But she never said his name. This uncertainty twists the narrative again, threading doubt through what had seemed stable. Later, he seeks out David Rios, a fellow instructor at the community college. Back in 1991, David had said very little, offering brief condolences and a statement about Elena being quiet and polite. But when the investigator finds him now, retired but still carrying a mild air of regret, David's demeanor shifts upon hearing the reopened context. I always thought they underestimated how deeply she felt things. David says, she never wanted to burden anyone, but that meant her worries went underground. There is a moment when David's voice softens unnaturally, revealing feelings carefully suppressed. She used to stay late in the photography room, he says. We talked sometimes. About books, about leaving home, about what it means to outgrow the life you thought you were supposed to live. The investigator senses something unsaid. A fondness, unacknowledged. A longing carefully folded away. Did you care for her? He asks plainly. David's answer is a slow, painful exhale. There were moments where, yes, but she didn't encourage or discourage anything. She never drew clear lines. I think she didn't know how to, not fully. This makes him reconsider the emotional map he's building. Perhaps Elena wasn't avoiding attachments, perhaps. She was overwhelmed by the weight of them. When he returns to Jay with questions about these other connections, Jay reacts not with anger, but with an exhaustion that looks strangely like sincerity. I wasn't the only one important to her, Jay admits. But that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I wanted her whole heart when I didn't even know what that meant. The investigator watches the way Jay's hands fold together, how his eyes drift toward the window. The guilt there is not performative. It is older, quieter, shaped by years of wondering what part he played in a story he never fully understood. But the most striking shift comes from Marianne, the librarian. When he returns to ask follow-up questions, she surprises him with a hesitant confession. There were rumors, she says softly. Not cruel ones, just whispers. People thought she was hiding something, that she'd changed after winter. More guarded, maybe. He asks what kind of change they noticed. She began avoiding certain conversations, Marianne says, especially about her past. And when anyone mentioned Jay, she seemed both grateful and frightened. Grateful and frightened. Closer and further. Held and overwhelmed. Each relationship paints a picture not of secret wrongdoing, but of emotional instability spreading through the people who cared for her. Not maliciousness, complexity. Not threat pressure. A gradual tightening around her, born from affection that could not find a safe shape. He begins to understand something difficult. The tension wasn't just between Elena and one person. It was between Elena and everyone who loved her in incomplete ways. And that makes the truth of her final night harder to narrow. Not easier, because in human tragedies, love can distort reality as effectively as malice. 5. Old secrets unfold, revealing betrayal and hidden personal motives. The breakthrough comes not from any confession, but from an unexpected envelope Nora sends him the following week. Inside are pages from Elena's old sketchbooks, scattered notes, charcoal outlines of mountain silhouettes, small fragments of thoughts captured in brief, trembling handwriting. At first, the drawings reveal nothing but the tenderness of someone trying to understand herself through shapes and shadows. But then, among the sketches, a series of short reflections catches his attention. They are written without dates, only impressions.
Jay means well. I wish wanting someone didn't feel like giving up part of myself. D wants honesty, but I barely trust my own voice. Lena sees more than she says. That scares me. If the truth hurts others, is silence kinder? These are not dramatic revelations. They are human confessions, whispered into pages meant for no one. But they complicate everything. They reveal a quiet, pervasive conflict within, her fear of disappointing people, her desire to keep peace, her worry that telling the truth would fracture the fragile harmony around her. Then, buried between sketches of rooftops and trees, a single sentence underlined twice. I told different versions of the same promise to different people. The investigator feels the air change around him as he reads that line. Because promises are binding, even when spoken softly. And when given to several people, even without intention, They create invisible obligations, strings pulling in conflicting directions. He sifts through memories others shared, Jay's hopefulness, David's quiet affection, Lena's protective concern. None of them claimed ownership, but all of them felt a claim. A softer betrayal emerges, not one of deceit but of divided trust. Didn't choose a single emotional path. She wandered between them, trying to avoid hurting anyone, and in doing so, carried more weight than she could bear. He revisits old phone logs, noticing patterns he had previously ignored. Calls between and Jay cluster around early evenings. Calls to David happen late at night. Visits to Lena's apartment occur at moments when the other relationships show strain. Not infidelity. Not manipulation. A person trying to be everything to everyone, while losing the quiet space needed for her own truth. He meets with Nora again, asking gently about earlier life, what she meant by someone from before, the unnamed burden. Nora hesitates, then finally opens a box she'd kept hidden for years. Inside are photographs of with a former in Denver, a relationship Nora describes as loving but heavy. He had wanted certainty, marriage, predictability, had wanted time, space, possibility. They parted kindly but with unspoken disappointment. What she feared most, Nora says softly, was letting people down. She carried those old feelings into everything she did. When she talked about Jay or her colleagues or even neighbors, she spoke as if she owed each of them something she didn't know how to give. The investigator feels a tightening in his chest, a recognition of how emotional obligations, silent, unassigned, unintentional, can overwhelm someone who already doubts her worth. Human motives are rarely sharp-edged. More often they blur into one another, tiny misunderstandings, misplaced hopes, unspoken expectations. This case was never about a single secret. It was about a lifetime of small, gentle burdens accumulating until the balance shifted. Everyone thought they were protecting her, or loving her, or helping her decide. But in their care, they each unknowingly asked something of her, something she could not refuse without feeling unkind. And somewhere between all those pulls, she lost her footing, literally or metaphorically, perhaps both. Betrayal exists here, yes, but not in the harsh sense. It is betrayal born of affection stretched thin, of people wanting the best for her while silently wanting something of her. In her final days, was caught in the center of a quiet emotional storm she never learned to name. And now the investigator understands. The truth of her death is not hidden by lies. It is hidden by too much truth, scattered across too many hearts. 6. Twist exposes the innocent as manipulative and morally corrupt. The twist does not come with a confession or a sudden revelation. It arrives quietly, almost reluctantly, from a person no one ever questioned, precisely because they seemed beyond suspicion. He returns to ask her about a small discrepancy, a library log showing she was present during an evening she claimed she'd gone home early. It isn't an accusation, merely a loose thread, but something in her posture shifts. She invites him inside, but her politeness feels rehearsed. The living room is meticulously arranged, every book aligned as if waiting for inspection. "I suppose it was only a matter of time," says, settling into a chair across from him. Her tone is not fearful. It is weary, as though she has been carrying something heavy for decades and has grown tired of concealing it. "Only a matter of time for what?" he asks softly. For someone to realize she wasn't as alone as people think that night. The room thickens. Silence gathers like dust in the corners. You saw her, he says, not a question. I went to check on her, replies. She sounded upset earlier. I thought I could help. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But when I arrived, she asked me to leave. She said she needed space. I thought she was overreacting. I thought she was being ungrateful. The investigator feels something shift in the air, an old truth becoming visible. What did you do? He asks, though he already senses it. I stayed in the hallway, she admits. I listened. I thought she was going to call someone else, and I didn't want her turning to them instead of me. Her voice trembles, not with remorse, but with the fragile defensiveness of someone who still believes they meant well. She depended on me more than she realized, says. I was the one who encouraged her to open up. I was the one who lent her books, who kept her company on long evenings. But she kept drifting toward others. Toward Jay, toward her sister, even toward that instructor at the college. There is an edge to her tone now, emotionally sharpened, not malicious but wounded. I thought if I reminded her how much she needed my guidance, she might listen, says quietly. Guidance. The word lands heavily. What did you say to her that night? He asks. His eyes glisten, but not with the clarity of regret, more with the frustration of being misunderstood after so many years. I told her she was making the wrong choices, that she was confusing affection with direction, that people would misinterpret her softness, that she was leaning on the wrong hearts. A pause. I told her she wasn't strong enough to manage all of them. He feels a slow chill run through him. Hadn't pushed her physically, but she had pushed her emotionally, pressed into a wound already tender from too many expectations. And then he prompts gently. She cried, says, quietly. I could barely hear her through the door. I didn't know whether to go back in or walk away, so I did neither. She closes her eyes. I told myself I was giving her space, but really, I wanted her to break down enough to come to me. The investigator feels a deep, sickening clarity settle in. Wasn't violent. She wasn't openly destructive. But she had exercised a subtle emotional control over undermining her confidence, framing herself as the only reliable support, shaping vulnerabilities to keep her close. This is the twist. The one who seemed the gentlest was, in truth, the one who added the final weight to fragile balance. Did you tell the original investigators any of this? He asks quietly. No, whispers, because I didn't do anything wrong. I only wanted to protect her. But protection, he realizes, can be its own form of harm when it demands dependence. When he leaves her house, he does not feel triumph or clarity. He feels overwhelmingly human sadness, the kind that comes from realizing that the tragedies people cause are often rooted in their longing to be needed. Was not evil, but her fear of being unimportant drove her to shape someone else's despair. And the case's long-standing ambiguity now feels painfully, inevitably human. 7. Concludes with open-ended moral tone, hiding truth saves someone. He returns to his office with the weight of everything he has learned pressing down over him like a muted snowfall. The building is quiet, the kind of quiet that makes even paper seem fragile. He lays out the threads, relationships, her divided emotional life, the unintentional burdens placed on her, the subtle manipulation she endured, the pressures she carried alone. There is no single truth sharp enough to close the case. Only a mosaic of delicate human contradictions. He writes a report, but he edits it 3 times, each revision removing details that, while technically truthful, would wound people who have already spent decades living with unspoken guilt. In the end, the version he submits is gentle, almost forgiving. It cites emotional strain, ambiguous circumstances, interpersonal pressure, without numbing, without exposing old tenderness that could reopen grief like a fresh cut. When he finishes, he sits back and lets the silence of the room settle around him. He knows the official story will remain what the community has chosen, a tragic death, the edges smoothed for collective comfort. The headline proclaiming the case solved will stand. And he knows it is incomplete. He also knows it is kinder that way. Some truths, once spoken aloud, do not free anyone, they only reassign sorrow. He imagines Nora receiving the gentler report, holding it with both hands, choosing to remember her sister with softness rather than complexity. He imagines Jay reading the findings, feeling both relieved and strangely hollow. He imagines sitting alone in her living room, never named, never accused, carrying her quiet guilt into the rest of her days. As he locks the file one final time, he feels neither victory nor defeat. Only the tender ache of understanding that justice does not always come from exposing everything. Sometimes compassion requires leaving certain truths in shadow. He walks out into the cool evening, the mountains in the distance catching the last faint light of day. The air is thin, gentle, uncertain, like a breath held between questions. He thinks of the night she stood on her balcony with the wind stirring her curtains, caught between wanting to stay and not knowing how to. Her absence lingers in the quiet spaces of the world, unresolved yet deeply felt. And as he steps into the fading light, he understands this. Some mysteries remain not because they cannot be solved, but because solving them would break something fragile that still needs protecting. There is no closure. Only the soft, haunting truth that some stories end without certainty. And that sometimes, that is the closest we come to mercy.